Imagine standing on the deck of a ship at night, surrounded by fog so thick that the ocean has completely disappeared. You cannot see the horizon, you cannot see another ship, you cannot even see very far beyond your own hands. But somewhere inside that white wall of fog, another ocean liner is moving directly toward you. You don't know exactly where it is. You don't know exactly what its captain sees. And neither does he know exactly what you see. Both ships have radar. Both crews know there is another vessel nearby. Both have experienced officers on the bridge. And yet, at 11:10 p.m. on July 25, 1956, those two ships are going to collide. One of them is the Andrea Doria, a magnificent Italian ocean liner carrying more than 1,600 people toward New York. The other is the Swedish liner Stockholm, traveling in the opposite direction. What makes the disaster so haunting isn't simply that two ships crashed in the fog. It's that both crews had information telling them another ship was there, and somehow, that information wasn't enough to prevent the collision. For the passengers aboard Andrea Doria, the night begins like any other Atlantic crossing. People are sleeping in their cabins. Others are finishing dinner. Some are walking through elegant corridors, surrounded by polished wood, brass fittings, and the quiet hum of a ship moving steadily through the Atlantic. The Andrea Doria is considered one of the finest liners of its time. She is large, luxurious, and modern, a symbol of Italian engineering and national pride. But outside the windows, the world is changing. The fog is becoming heavier. Visibility is collapsing. The ocean is still, but the danger is already there. Somewhere ahead, the Stockholm is moving through the same darkness. On both bridges, officers are watching their instruments, listening for information, and trying to understand what the fog is hiding. Radar can detect another vessel, but radar does not simply hand a captain the answer. Someone has to interpret the information. Someone has to estimate distance, direction, speed, and movement. And when two ships are approaching each other, a small misunderstanding can become a very large problem. The two vessels continue on their courses. The distance between them decreases. Neither ship can clearly see the other through the fog. Crews are now making decisions based on instruments, calculations, visibility, and assumptions about what the other ship is doing. Then suddenly, the darkness changes. The Stockholm appears through the fog. For a brief moment, the crews can finally see what their instruments had been warning them about. But by then, there is almost no time left. At approximately 11:10 p.m., the Stockholm's bow crashes into the starboard side of the Andrea Doria. Steel tears through steel. The impact is enormous. Passengers are thrown from beds. Furniture moves violently across rooms. Glass shatters. People who had been sleeping only seconds earlier are suddenly thrown into chaos. The Andrea Doria has been struck deep in her side and the damage is devastating. But the ship does not immediately disappear beneath the ocean. Instead, she begins to settle into a dangerous list. Slowly, the deck tilts. Floors begin to feel like walls. Doors become difficult to open. Furniture slides across rooms. Passengers struggle to remain standing. And somewhere inside the ship, people are realizing that this is not an ordinary emergency. This is a fight for survival. The crew begins organizing an evacuation, but the angle of the ship creates a terrible problem. Several lifeboats on the damaged side cannot be launched properly. The ship has enough lifeboat capacity on paper, but the physical condition of the vessel makes that capacity difficult to use. Passengers gather at emergency stations wearing life jackets. Some are crying. Some are calling for family members. Others are simply standing still, unable to understand what has happened. Outside, the fog remains thick. The ocean is dark. The Andrea Doria is wounded and leaning heavily. And then, through the darkness, help begins to arrive. Other ships hear the distress calls and change course toward the disaster. One of the most important is the French liner Isle de France. Instead of continuing safely through the fog, her crew turns toward the damaged Andrea Doria. As the ship approaches, the crew sees something enormous emerging from the darkness. The Italian liner sitting dangerously low in the water, surrounded by lifeboats in confusion. The rescue becomes a race against time. Lifeboats move through the fog. Survivors are transferred from the damaged liner to other vessels. Children are carried into waiting arms. Injured passengers are helped across decks. Families search desperately for one another, and something remarkable happens. The Stockholm, the ship that struck Andrea Doria, also participates in the rescue. The same vessel responsible for the collision is now helping save the people aboard the ship it hit. For the passengers, the identity of the ship matters less than the fact that someone has come. In the middle of a disaster caused by human decisions, other human beings are now risking themselves to undo some of the damage. Through the night, the evacuation continues. The Andrea Doria remains afloat, but she is becoming more unstable. Water is entering the damaged sections. The list becomes worse, yet the ship remains there for hours, giving rescuers time to reach people who otherwise might have been lost. That time becomes the difference between catastrophe and survival. By morning, most of the passengers and crew have been rescued. But 51 people have died in the disaster, including 46 aboard Andrea Doria and 5 aboard Stockholm. The collision has taken lives, but the rescue has prevented an even greater tragedy. Then, at approximately 10:09 a.m. on July 26, nearly 11 hours after the collision, the Andrea Doria finally disappears beneath the Atlantic. The ship that had been a symbol of Italian elegance is gone. The ocean closes over the wreck, leaving only scattered debris, lifeboats, and survivors behind. But the sinking does not end the story. In some ways, it begins the real mystery, because now investigators have a question that is much harder to answer than simply asking why the ship sank. How did two experienced crews operating two modern ships collide in open water when both ships had radar? Who saw what? When did they see it? What did they believe the other ship was doing? And which decisions made the collision unavoidable? Investigators begin examining the evidence. Radar information, ship positions, courses, speeds, visibility, communications, statements from officers aboard both vessels. But instead of finding one simple mistake, they encounter something much more complicated. The two sides do not tell exactly the same story. Each crew has its own understanding of what happened during the final minutes before impact. And this is where the mystery becomes deeply human. A radar screen can show you that another object exists, but it cannot tell you everything about what that object is going to do. A ship's position can be measured. Its movement can be estimated, but human beings still have to interpret the information. They have to decide whether the other vessel is turning, maintaining course, slowing down, or doing something else entirely. And in dense fog, those decisions become even more difficult. A few degrees of difference in interpretation can become hundreds of meters of separation, or almost no separation at all. The Andrea Doria and Stockholm were not simply two machines following perfect mathematical paths. They were being operated by people, and those people were trying to understand each other from a distance, using incomplete information. Somewhere between what one crew believed and what the other crew believed, the safe distance disappeared. And once the ships finally appeared through the fog, there was no longer enough time to correct everything. That may be the most unsettling part of the disaster. There was no massive storm forcing the ships together. There was no iceberg suddenly appearing from nowhere. There was no explosion destroying a bridge. There was simply fog, instruments, calculations, decisions, and two ships moving through the same piece of ocean. The disaster reminds us that technology does not eliminate human error. Sometimes it simply changes the form human error takes. The officers had information. The problem was understanding what that information meant, and understanding what another crew was going to do with the same information. After the disaster, the investigation continues, but the collision never produces a single explanation that satisfies everyone. Responsibility is debated, evidence is examined, testimonies are compared, and over time, the Andrea Doria becomes something more than a sunken ship. She becomes a case study in how complicated a disaster can become when two groups of intelligent, experienced people remember the same event differently. But there is another reason the Andrea Doria story refuses to disappear. The ship is still down there, roughly 240 feet beneath the Atlantic surface, resting on the seabed. And unlike many famous shipwrecks, reaching the Andrea Doria is not simply a matter of swimming down and looking around. The wreck has become one of the most challenging and dangerous destinations in technical diving. Strong currents can sweep through the area. Visibility can change suddenly. Silt can destroy visibility in seconds. The wreck itself is deteriorating. Corridors and rooms that were once part of a magnificent ocean liner are now dark, damaged spaces filled with hazards. Divers have entered those spaces looking for artifacts, photographs, and a glimpse into the final moments of the ship. Some have paid the ultimate price. The wreck has claimed the lives of divers over the years, adding another layer to the Andrea Doria's legacy. And that creates an eerie connection between the people who died aboard the ship in 1956 and those who later entered its remains. Both groups entered a world where visibility could disappear in seconds. Both depended on judgment. Both had to understand their surroundings before making the next move. And beneath the Atlantic, the Andrea Doria continues to change. Metal corrodes, structures weaken, currents move through the wreck. The ocean slowly takes back what humans once built. The elegant liner that carried wealthy passengers, families, immigrants, and travelers across the Atlantic is now a silent structure on the seabed. But the most important thing about the Andrea Doria is not the wreck itself. It is the question that remains attached to it, because everyone knows why the ship sank. Stockholm struck her. Water entered. The ship lost stability. Eventually, she went beneath the surface. That part is not a mystery. The mystery is what happened during those final minutes before the impact. What did each bridge know? What did each officer believe? Which course changes were made? Which calculations were correct? Which were wrong? And at what exact moment did the collision become unavoidable? Perhaps there was never going to be one simple answer. Disasters are often easier to understand when we can point to one mistake and one person responsible. But the Andrea Doria does not give us that comfort. Instead, it gives us something more disturbing, a chain of decisions, assumptions, and interpretations that gradually narrowed the path until there was nowhere left to escape. That is why the story still feels unfinished. The fog eventually lifted. The survivors returned home. Families began rebuilding their lives. Investigators eventually closed their work. But the Andrea Doria remained behind. She sank into the darkness and became part of the ocean floor. More than 70 years later, the wreck still holds the image of that night. 2 ships, 2 crews, 1 fog, 1 collision, and a question that has survived longer than almost everyone who witnessed it. If both ships knew another vessel was somewhere in that darkness, why wasn't that knowledge enough to keep them apart? Maybe that is the real mystery of the Andrea Doria. Not that people couldn't see through the fog, but that sometimes even when we have information, technology, experience, and warning, we can still misunderstand what is directly in front of us. The ocean did not need to hide the truth forever. It only needed to hide it for a few minutes. And in those few minutes, 2 ships came together. One survived long enough to save hundreds. The other eventually disappeared beneath the sea. And somewhere between radar screens, fog, human judgment, and the final sight of steel emerging from darkness, the truth of exactly what went wrong became almost as difficult to recover as the ship itself. The Andrea Doria is still down there, silent beneath the Atlantic, slowly disappearing into the sea. And perhaps that is why her story continues to haunt people, because the wreck is visible. The evidence is still there. The ship is still there. But the one thing everyone wants to recover, the complete truth about those final minutes, may have disappeared into the fog forever.